I found out my sister had sold our childhood home from a real estate app notification of all things. A little chime on my phone in a Seattle coffee shop, the kind of alert I'd set up years earlier out of nostalgia, just to see the old place pop up whenever the market shifted in that corner of Asheville. New listing, 214 Laurel Hollow Road. Photos of the wraparound porch where my mother used to shell peas. Photos of my childhood bedroom, repainted a flat contractor white, staged with furniture that had never belonged to anyone who'd actually lived there. Listed by Danielle Osei, my sister. The house wasn't hers to sell. Our mother, Ruth Calder, died when I was 26 and Danielle was 29. She left the house to us jointly 50-50 on paper, but what almost nobody in the family knew, because I'd spent 4 years quietly buying my sister out one small transaction at a time, was that Danielle had sold me her half 18 months after Mom's death. It wasn't a betrayal at the time. It was a rescue. Danielle had been drowning. A divorce, a business that failed, debts stacking up faster than she could see them clearly. And she'd come to me in tears one October night asking if I'd buy her out of her half of the house so she could keep her own home in Charlotte from going into foreclosure. I did it quietly through a private sale handled by a real estate attorney my mother had used for decades. A careful, kind man named Foster Byrne who filed everything correctly, recorded the deed transfer with the county, and told us both gently that this kind of arrangement was more common between siblings than we'd think. I never mentioned it again. Danielle never asked. We let the house sit empty, technically ours, in family conversation, a place we both still called home even after I owned it outright, because some truths felt unnecessary to say out loud as long as nobody was getting hurt. Then, for years later, apparently believing she still held half ownership, Danielle listed it for $640,000 without telling me, without checking a single county record, without once considering that maybe, just maybe, the sister who'd quietly bailed her out of foreclosure might have actually followed through on the paperwork. I could have simply called her. One phone call, one uncomfortable conversation, and the listing disappears, the buyer walks away confused, and the whole thing becomes a strange footnote in family history. I didn't call her. Because 3 days after finding the listing I found something else. A group text between Danielle and our cousin Priya that had been accidentally forwarded to me by my aunt, who'd meant to send it to someone else entirely. She'll never even notice, Danielle had written. She hasn't set foot in that house in 6 years. I need this money before Ronnie finds out about the business account. If she asks, I'll just say I always own my half. She won't remember the paperwork, she never pays attention to that stuff. I read it 4 times. Ronnie was Danielle's second husband. The business account was something I didn't yet understand, but the rest of it I understood perfectly. My sister wasn't confused about who owned the house. She was counting on me not noticing that she was stealing it. I let the sale proceed. That was the decision that surprised even me, sitting alone in my apartment at 11 at night, rereading that text until the words stopped making sense. I didn't call Foster Byrne to block the transfer. I didn't call Danielle to confront her. I let the buyers, a young couple named the Hendersons relocating from Nashville, sweet and eager and completely unaware they were about to fall into the middle of a family war, proceed all the way to closing. I waited until the day of settlement. Foster Byrne, still practicing at 71, still the kind of lawyer who believed paperwork was a form of moral seriousness, sat in on the closing at my request, silent, waiting. When the title company's closing agent pulled the deed for signature and found, as she was required to, that the recorded owner of 214 Laurel Hollow Road was not Danielle Osei but me, sole owner on record with Buncombe County for the past 4 years, the room went very quiet. Danielle's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not embarrassment. Not shame. Calculation, fast and cold, the same look she used to get as a teenager caught in a lie, searching for the fastest exit that wouldn't cost her anything. There's obviously been some clerical error, she said to the Hendersons, to the closing agent, to everyone but me. My sister and I own this jointly. We'll get this sorted out this week. There's no error, Foster said quietly, sliding the recorded deed across the table, dated 4 years earlier, with both our signatures on the original sale. Your sister purchased your half of this property in good faith at your request, to help you avoid foreclosure on your Charlotte home. I handled the transaction myself. The Hendersons, understandably, walked away from the deal entirely, which cost Danielle a $10,000 earnest money forfeiture she couldn't afford to lose. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was what happened after in the parking lot, When Danielle finally dropped the performance and asked me, voice shaking, how long I'd known she didn't actually think she still owned it. "I've known for a week," I said. "Long enough to read a text you sent Priya." I watched something in her collapse. Not remorse, not yet, just the particular exhaustion of a person realizing they'd been caught in a lie they'd told so many times they'd half started believing it themselves. And then, because family secrets rarely arrive alone, she told me about Ronnie. Ronnie Osei ran a small logistics company outside Charlotte, and for 2 years he'd been quietly siphoning money from its accounts to cover gambling debts he'd hidden from Danielle entirely, debts that had finally caught up with him in the form of a federal investigation into the company's finances. Danielle had found out 3 weeks before listing the house. Not from Ronnie, but from an FBI agent who'd shown up at her door asking questions about wire transfers she'd never heard of, attached to an account she'd unknowingly co-signed on years earlier as a favor to her husband. She wasn't just broke. She was potentially, unknowingly, criminally exposed, a co-signer on accounts tied to fraud she'd had no part in and no knowledge of, and she'd panicked, reached for the fastest asset she could think of. A childhood home she'd convinced herself, through sheer desperate repetition, was still half hers, and tried to liquidate it before the walls closed in around her marriage. This was the part that reframed everything. I'd spent a week hating my sister for trying to steal a house out from under me. What I found instead, once the anger cooled enough to actually listen, was a woman who'd built her entire adult life on top of men who used her trust as leverage. First a business partner in her failed venture years earlier, and now a husband quietly bankrupting her from the inside while she had no idea her name was attached to any of it. She hadn't lied to steal from me specifically. She'd lied because lying to me felt like the only door left in a house that had every other exit sealed. I didn't forgive her instantly, and I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I simply hugged her in a parking lot and everything dissolved into tearful reconciliation wouldn't be true. What I did instead was call Foster Byrne back the next morning and ask him to help me do 2 things. First, we connected Danielle with a federal defense attorney Foster trusted, someone who specialized in exactly the kind of accidental cosigner exposure she was facing, and who confirmed within 2 weeks that because she'd had no knowledge of the fraudulent transfers and no access to the accounts beyond her name on paper, she was almost certainly in the clear. A witness, not a target. Ronnie was not so lucky. He was indicted 4 months later and is currently serving a sentence in a federal facility in Georgia, and Danielle filed for divorce the same week the indictment came down. Second, I didn't sell the house. I never had any intention to. Instead, 6 months after the failed closing, I signed the deed back over to both of us jointly, for real this time, on paper, filed and recorded, with one condition Danielle didn't argue with, because by then she understood exactly why I needed it: that neither of us could sell, mortgage, or transfer any part of it without the other's full, notarized, in-person agreement. No more quiet arrangements. No more assumptions about who owned what. We spent last Thanksgiving there together, the first time either of us had slept in that house in over 6 years. My mother's peas are long gone from the porch railing, but Danielle planted new ones in the spring, and I drove down in October just to see if they'd taken. They had. Some houses get stolen by strangers, by banks, by fires or foreclosures or bad luck. Ours nearly got stolen by 2 sisters who'd each spent years assuming the other one already knew the truth, when the real theft, all along, had been a silence neither of us had meant to build a family history on top of.